Some people don't build walls to keep others out. They build them to keep their own emotions from spilling into places where they could be hurt again. Because somewhere in their story, the safest way to survive was to disappear behind their own silence. There is a certain kind of person who moves through the world in quiet, careful steps, as if every emotion is a fragile object they must carry without dropping. They live their life behind an invisible pane of glass, close enough to see, close enough to hear, close enough to love, but just far enough that no one can fully reach them. These are the emotionally unreachable, and the truth is, they rarely look broken. On the outside, they appear strong, composed, self-contained. They speak calmly, they function well, they handle crises, they survive storms with a kind of steady, almost eerie resilience. They don't fall apart in front of anyone. They don't collapse, they don't confess, they don't expose the tremble inside their chest. And so, the world calls them independent, mature, emotionally strong. But none of those words describe what is really going on inside. Emotional distance isn't strength. It's a survival mechanism wearing the costume of stability. If you've ever met someone like this, you might have felt the strange ache of being close to them, while also feeling impossibly far. They can sit right next to you, share a conversation, share a meal, share a life. And yet some part of them remains untouched, unseen, unreachable. You can pour love into them and still feel like it never sinks in. You can offer comfort, safety, understanding, and they will accept it politely, but they will not let it change them. They won't let it enter the places where they truly hurt. It's not that they don't want connection. It's not that they don't crave intimacy. It's not that they don't feel. God, they feel everything. Too much, sometimes. So deeply that it threatens to break them open. And this is why they've learned to hold themselves apart. Not because they're cold, but because they're afraid that if they ever let someone in, the emotions they've buried will rise like an ocean and drown them. Emotionally unreachable people often grew up in homes where expressing their feelings was met with dismissal, punishment, or silence. They learned, far too early, that emotions were inconvenient, unsafe, or simply too heavy for the people around them to hold. So they began to swallow their sadness, tuck away their fear, hide their guilt, bury their longing. They became children who learned to self-soothe, not by seeking comfort, but by erasing their needs completely. They were taught sometimes through words, sometimes through gestures, sometimes through the empty quiet of emotional neglect, that needing others meant being disappointed. So they began to rely only on themselves. They built emotional independence out of necessity, not desire. And independence, once it solidifies into a habit, becomes a fortress. By the time these children grow into adults, they no longer recognize the difference between independence and isolation. They have lived behind their walls for so long that vulnerability feels like a foreign language, a language they once spoke fluently, but have forgotten how to use. And when someone tries to love them, tries to get close, tries to see past the surface, it triggers something dark and ancient inside them. The memory of every time they needed someone and no one came. So instead of stepping toward connection, they retreat. They shut down. They become distant, quiet, gentle but unreachable. And most people don't understand the difference between withdrawing out of apathy and withdrawing out of fear. Fear is the heartbeat of emotional unreachability, not the loud, trembling kind of fear people talk about, but the quiet kind. The kind that sits beneath the skin like a cold pulse. The kind that whispers, "Don't let them close. They'll leave. They'll hurt you. They'll expect things you can't give." Emotionally unreachable people have learned that opening up often leads to losing control. And control is the one thing they cling to with silent desperation. When they keep their emotions hidden, they stay safe. When they stay safe, they feel steady. And steadiness is the closest thing to peace they've ever known. They are the kind of people who feel the weight of the world but refuse to show it. They think their emotions will burden others, overwhelm them, push them away. So they edit themselves constantly, trimming away the parts that feel too raw, too heavy, too human. They present a curated version of themselves, calm, composed, thoughtful. People admire them for their self-control, their emotional discipline, their ability to stay unshaken. But self-control is often just fear with a disciplined posture. They have learned to compartmentalize pain with surgical precision. When something hurts, they internalize it. When something scares them, They rationalize it. When something disappoints them, they bury it so deep that even they struggle to find it again. Their inner world becomes a maze of sealed rooms, each one holding an emotion they once felt but never expressed. And over time, these rooms stack up inside them like unread letters messages they were too afraid to send to anyone else. Being close to someone emotionally unreachable can feel like holding your breath underwater. You wait for them to open up, for them to soften, for them to let you in. You feel their affection, their care, their presence, but never their vulnerability. You get fragments of their truth, glimpses of their depth, flashes of their tenderness, but it never stays long. It never roots itself. It never becomes something you can hold. They pull back the moment things get too real. They retreat when emotions grow too intense. They vanish inside their own mind before you even realize the distance widening between you. And just when you start to believe they don't care, they surprise you with some small, quiet gesture, a look, a sentence, a moment of unguarded honesty that reminds you they feel deeply but fear loudly. Emotionally unreachable people often love with a kind of aching subtlety. They love in actions rather than words, in presence rather than openness, in consistency rather than confession. They show love in the ways they believe are safest, by staying, by listening, by helping, by holding parts of you they refuse to reveal in themselves. They know how to love others far more easily than they know how to be loved. Letting someone love them means being seen, and being seen means being vulnerable. And vulnerability, to them, is synonymous with danger. It reminds them of times they opened their hearts only to have them dismissed, misunderstood, taken advantage of, or broken. So they protect themselves by staying emotionally unreachable, believing it's the lesser pain. Inside their mind, there is a quiet war happening. Part of them longs for connection, craves intimacy, wants to be understood without having to explain the depth of their loneliness. But another part, the louder, older part, insists on staying hidden. This is the part shaped by every wound, every disappointment, every moment they realized it was safer to shut down than to risk being open. This part tells them that love is unpredictable, attachment is dangerous, vulnerability is a gamble they cannot afford. And so they listen to the fear instead of the longing. They become experts at maintaining just enough closeness to avoid being alone, but just enough distance to avoid being hurt. It's a delicate balance, one they maintain with the precision of a tightrope walker. To close, and they panic. To distant, and they ache. So they hover in the in-between. Visible, but untouchable. Present, but unreachable. Loving, but protected. When emotionally unreachable people finally break down, which they almost never do in front of others, it's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, internal, a kind of silent implosion that happens behind closed doors. They sit in the dark, feeling everything they refused to feel earlier, letting the flood they held back finally wash over them. And afterward, they rebuild themselves like nothing happened. They clean up the evidence of their loneliness, straighten their expression, steady their voice, and go back into the world as if the collapse was just a dream. They fear their emotions the way some people fear storms, not because storms are inherently destructive, but because storms reveal the fragility of everything that stands in their path. They don't want anyone to see their storm. They don't want anyone to see the chaos inside. So they hold back the thunder, swallow the lightning, hide the rain. And in doing so, they become a drought in their own life, dry, controlled, predictable, but starving for something they don't know how to receive. People often misunderstand them. They assume emotional distance means lack of interest, lack of affection, lack of desire. But distance, for these individuals, is not rejection. It is protection. It is the only way they know how to manage the intensity of their inner world. They want to connect. But the fear of needing someone, really needing them, terrifies them more than loneliness ever could, because needing means risking. Needing means exposing a weakness. Needing means handing someone a fragile part of their soul and hoping they don't drop it. And emotionally unreachable people have learned that hope is dangerous. Inside them is a lifetime of unspoken emotions, unshed tears, unprocessed wounds. They carry their past like a shadow that never quite leaves, following them into every relationship, every conversation, every vulnerable moment, and they don't know how to let it go. They don't know how to feel safe in the presence of another person's compassion. They don't know how to allow themselves to fall apart in someone else's hands. The idea of being held not physically, but emotionally feels more threatening than comforting. But here is the deepest truth about emotionally unreachable people. They were not born this way. They were shaped this way. Somewhere along the line, life taught them that their emotions were too much or not enough. Too intense or too inconvenient, too tender or too vulnerable. And so they adapted. They built walls. They learned to self-contain. They taught themselves to survive without softness, without openness, without reliance. And survival became their identity. Yet even in their most unreachable state, they remain profoundly human. Beneath the armor is someone who wants to be touched by understanding, who wants to be seen without being judged, who wants to be known without having to unearth every buried piece of their past. They want closeness, they just don't know how to tolerate the fear that comes with it. They want love, they just don't know how to trust it. They want connection, they just don't know how to feel safe within it. If you are someone who feels emotionally unreachable, it's not because you are broken. It's because you adapted to a world that didn't give you the safety you deserved. You learned to protect yourself in the only way you knew how. Emotional distance was not a flaw, it was a shield. A necessary one. But shields, eventually, become heavy. And the weight of being unreachable can become its own kind of loneliness. You don't open up slowly. You open up suddenly, in rare, fleeting moments, when your soul feels safe enough to breathe. And then you close again just as quickly, startled by your own vulnerability. The people who love you might not understand this rhythm. But it is the rhythm of someone who has taught themselves to ration their vulnerability in order to survive. But even you, with your walls and your silence, and your careful distance, have a longing that refuses to die. Some part of you still hopes to be reached. Still hopes that someone will understand the language you speak without words. Still hopes that connection is possible without the fear of breaking. And that hope is the proof that you are not unreachable, just afraid. Just cautious. Just shaped by a past that taught you to stay hidden. And fear, no matter how long it has lived inside you, is not the end of your story. It is simply the beginning of your healing. You don't have to dismantle your walls all at once. You don't have to spill everything you've held inside. You don't have to become an open book overnight. You can begin by allowing yourself to be human, imperfect, emotional, vulnerable. You can begin by acknowledging that your emotions are not a threat, but a truth. You can begin by letting yourself be seen, not all at once, but piece by piece, because no one is truly unreachable. Some people just need to be approached gently, patiently, without pressure, without judgment. Some people need to be trusted before they can trust. Some people need to feel safe before they can feel anything at all. And maybe you are one of them. But being unreachable is not who you are. It is who you became when you had no other choice. Now you do.